Okay, now that Mr. Glowski's here, I think we can get started. I want to welcome everyone to the April 9th, 2014 Planning and Zoning meeting. If you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, roll call, please.
Let's see. Rich Overtino, Jake McDonald, Jeff Moore,
Here.
John Nuremberger is here, Shara Bilderbach,
Here.
Michael Daming,
Here.
Gan Glowski,
Here.
Jennifer Hansen,
Here.
David Devitt,
Here.
David Plefka,
Here.
Clint Lewis.
Here.
We have a quorum, Ms. Sharon.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Nuremberger. We do have a new member tonight. Clint Lewis was approved by the Board of Aldermen on Monday, right, to join our commission. Clint, do you want to introduce yourself to the commission and the audience members?
Sure. My name's Clint Lewis. I've been a Brentwood resident for about 10 years. Spoke with a couple of folks and just wanted to get involved and help build the community. And this opportunity came up, so I'm kind of thrown in. I think I was appointed Monday, so kind of thrown in the fire here, a little on-the-job training. So, anyway, thank you.
Yeah, they're usually spilling out into the hallway over here. Good meeting to start with. So we have two items on the agenda tonight. The first is an item of old business pertaining to flood hazard control. The second is new business pertaining to sign regulations that staff has asked the commission to take a look at. We have our zoning council here to discuss some proposed sign regulations. Zoning council charge attorney's fees, and in the interest of keeping those attorney's fees down, the chair would entertain a motion to take up a brief discussion of those sign regulations that we have before us before we get into the flood issue.
So
Mr. Chairman,
moved.
I so move. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we have two counsel from Curtis Hines, Garrett O'Keefe. I'm sorry, I missed your name. Ed?
My name's Ed.
Ed, that's right. And the commission should have a document in which Curtis Hines, Garrett, and O'Keefe has reviewed several proposed changes to the sign code. And we're not going to get into these in detail. What I had in mind is, frankly, we'd approach this as we did the recodification effort with Sullivan Publication, and commission members can look at these in detail after Ed reviews generally what changes he's recommending, and then we can send individually, we can send our comments, questions to Mr. Wise, who will tabulate those, answer those, and circulate answers to our concerns, so we'll be able to address these in a more comprehensive fashion once and for all at the next meeting. But Ed, if you'd like to just generally provide an overview of what you're recommending and why.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, everyone. As the Chairman mentioned, I'm just going to give a very kind of brief overview as to the nature of the changes that are contained in the amended code. Essentially, it's about 3 years ago now, the 8th Circuit handed down an opinion involving the City of St. Louis dealing with signs. I don't know if you're familiar with the end eminent domain of use sign that was painted on the side of the building. But the long and short of it is that opinion has, I think, caused cities to have to take a look at how they, administer their sign codes and how they regulate signs. The take home from that is that cities do have somewhat narrower powers to regulate signs, especially when you do so based upon the content of those signs. The kind of importance in that 8th Circuit case has even thrown some doubt over the traditional notion that you can treat non-commercial signs kind of in preference to commercial signs. I think the safer approach now is for cities to treat signs equally without regard to content. And so it's with that kind of view that the changes to the code were undertaken. For the most part, all the edits try and remove any references to the content of the content of the sign relative to whether signs are allowed or the size of signs. We try to avoid making substantive changes to the size of signs and numbers of signs that are allowed on premises, and really just try to regulate or keep in line with the city's current regulations. So I think to that end, the new code a high degree of flexibility that will allow, not only private property owners but commercial property owners kind of greater flexibility with how they use their signs while still furthering the important, safety, aesthetical interests that the city wishes to promote with its sign code. Because as long as we keep our code content neutral, we can continue to further those interests. If we start straying down lines of, okay, signs that say X are allowed here, but Y aren't, then things like aesthetics and traffic safety haven't been held to have a sufficiently high interest to allow us to regulate along those lines. Like I say, if there are any questions or if people would like me to dig a little deeper into things, I'm certainly happy to at this point.
Okay, questions for council?
Just
Ms. Hanson, go ahead.
Did you drafted the changes yourself?
Correct, yeah.
Did you use any existing changes that I guess other cities or municipalities have made, or is this just your own drafting, your own hand?
Largely Richmond Heights, but I did Richmond Heights as well. So I guess that one was largely I had done myself. And then,
Do you know when Richmond Heights made the change?
it would have been, it was in 2013. I can't recall exactly when. I think at least a year ago, I'd say, or around a year ago.
Have you consulted with anyone who's told you about problems they've had or issues they've had or unforeseen consequences to these changes?
No, although interestingly, I did get a question along the lines of what you'll see in some of these are the increased flexibility to allow all property owners to have maybe one sign or however many the city wishes to have ultimately, where it's almost a no questions asked sign, and this is kind of to allow people if they want to put stop the war or whatever up on their property. We did have a question was raised in a commercial district where commercial properties are also allowed those one signs, which is if they only want to have one sign, and that one sign if complies with the exempt sign, which is normally 16 square feet, and that's what I believe we have in this code. Well, we do have in this code. Can they have that instead of having their 25 square foot sign or whatever? And I think that's one kind of side effect of this is that, yes. But of course, then if down the line they want a second sign, they either have to replace that one or apply for the 25 square foot one. So that's kind of one kind of effect that this kind of code may have, whereas, when it's very rigid as to what your signs can say, that, that wouldn't be an effect of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Further questions? Yeah, Mr. Nurnberger.
Didn't we also Ellen, she came from, I think it was, where was the city she worked in before?
Creve
She
Coeur.
had, what's that?
Creve Coeur.
Yeah. And she was, a lot of this terminology, I think, was pulled from some of that, her experience there. Yeah. Do you know about any of these changes being made? Have you talked to anybody from there? I know that she's worked there, and they had a pretty stringent sign code that we were trying to kind of mirror. So
Yeah, Creve Coeur actually have, Carl Lumley, who's another attorney in our office, is the city attorney in Creve Coeur, and Creve Coeur underwent an extensive change and revision of their sign code based upon the same issues that we discussed here. I did work with Carl Sumwell on the Creve Coeur one as well. So there are a lot of the themes that Creve Coeur have in theirs are consistent with the ones in here. It was a very long drawn out process in Creve Coeur as well. There was a lot of, they had multiple public hearings and things.
right.
So with respect to the reference to Creve Coeur you made, is this a code from a few years ago or very recent?
Ellen just worked there. She was here for 6 or 7 years, so she was working there before. So I know that they were doing a lot of sign issues back when she was there. So it's like she had a lot of experience in that. So I just...
Yeah, in which case, I think, again, I'm not sure exactly when, but I think Creve Coeur adopted their amended sign code at some point within the last 12 months.
I think theirs was a lot more strict than ours.
It was. It's, they had a very lengthy and, so they were eager in light of the, I'm not sure it's necessarily a change in the law, but certainly a clarification in the law to try and, slim down a lot of this content-based stuff. So this is consistent with what Creve Coeur and Richmond Heights, who I've mentioned before, and I believe other cities are in the process of looking at it as well.
Thank you, Mr.
Sure.
Chairman.
So this isn't a matter of preferred language or preferred revisions to suit a particular constituency. This is what you think is necessary to comply with the existing law.
Yeah, it's an attempt to toe the line between what's an enforceable, workable, and beneficial sign code with what the strictures of the law are, and what we can regulate and how we can do it,
Okay.
to avoid kind of the confusions that can arise with when there's uncertainty in the law.
Okay. Further questions? Okay, how about is everyone okay with that proposed course of action? Everyone taking an opportunity to really delve into this in detail, identify any questions, identify any concerns, send those over to Justin, who can tabulate those into a spreadsheet and hopefully answer any questions before our next meeting and pick it up at the next meeting, next regular meeting, and move forward. Anybody have a problem with that approach?
Are we not going to talk about it at site plan?
Oh, yeah, we can.
I'd like to actually have a discussion about it, like with the commission members.
Sure. No, I would prefer to do it with the audience present, but that's fine. If the commission is inclined to have a site plan subcommittee meeting, we could do that. What's the pleasure?
It gives us more time to talk about it.
Okay.
If we have a subcommittee.
Everybody all right with that, going to subcommittee on this?
I would suggest we send the comments to Justin and have him compile them and circulate them before we have a site plan
Yeah,
meeting.
that'd be fine. So, Mr. Wise, what are we looking at for site plan subcommittee?
It is April 30th.
So that would be one, I have a conflict on the 30th, so to the extent we want to have a site plan subcommittee meeting, I would request that we do it on the 23rd. That was one reason we did that subcommittee.
I'm going to Jeff City that day, but I should be able to make it back.
23rd?
Yeah.
Everybody okay with the 23rd?
Is there an urgency to this?
Mr. Wise?
No.
I would suggest we table it till the next regular meeting and then decide if we need to send it to site plan.
Okay, is that a motion, Mr. Glasky?
It is.
Is there a second? Second. Okay, motion is second to table this sign regulation package to the next regular session. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. Thank you very much,
Thank you very much.
Council.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
do
sir.
we need a council to come back at that meeting, or should we wait until we have the discussion, and if we need them to come back, we would call
Why
them
don't we,
back?
I would suggest why don't we play it by ear?
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
see what the result is after the commission's put together their questions and concerns, and Mr. Wise has tabulated everything.
Right.
So we'll be in touch. Thank you
you very
for your
much.
presentation.
Thank you.
What's the deadline for that?
Okay, we have minutes of the March 12, 2014 meeting that we need to approve. Has everybody had an opportunity to review those? Are there any revisions? Yes, Ms. Hanson?
I have one, page 4, after Ms. Hanson, ask for staff's understanding what would happen if the city does choose. It should be does not choose.
Any further changes to those minutes? Seeing none, they'll be adopted as amended with Ms. Hanson's amendment. Next item of business is for old business, a petition for approval of an amendment to Chapter 25, Article 6, Division 8 of the Brentwood zoning ordinance pertaining to flood hazard control regulations. This is the third meeting that this commission has taken this matter up. It's been given the attention that it deserves, and clearly we have some interested citizens in the room, and many of whom I recall seeing at the previous meeting. So I think there's been a lot of good debate on this issue, but I think it's time to move forward one way or the other. The one item when we do, we're going to have deliberation, we're going to open it up to the commission, to the audience members to ask the commissioners any questions or to state their viewpoints. The one item I would point out as a matter of order would be, regardless of what we do, I believe that there was consensus on these proposed revisions, all of the proposed revisions, except for the definitions of substantial improvement and substantial damage. That's what we had all of the debate about at the last meeting. So to the extent that there is a motion that's made tonight, I would request that the motion be to approve either all of the suggested revisions or all of the suggested revisions except for the two definitions that have garnered so much debate. But with that being said, let's talk about those two definitions. And Mr. Wise, can you bring the commission and the audience up to speed on You put together a nice presentation here for the commission here. Can you bring the audience and the commission up to speed with where we are since the last meeting?
Sure. A first item that I did want to make sure everyone was aware of, I handed out a letter that was submitted by an attorney for a developer in town, DDR. They're representing DDR. So I wanted to make sure that you all received that letter and that it's part of the record for this meeting. When we left the March meeting, there was not any specific direction that the commission was asking staff to pull some further research. But in light of that, I did take the opportunity to try to find as many graphics as I could. We'd had a lot of conversation, but there were a lot of questions on what some of those items actually looked like. So I searched through, tried to find a couple local examples, as well as pulled from some of FEMA's guidebooks on exactly what a partially elevated structure is, what a fully elevated structure is, and kind of when those triggers kick in. And those are detailed in your packet. And then tried to follow several of those with examples of how this has actually been done in Brentwood. There was one example of a home, a new construction home that was constructed in the regulatory floodplain that was constructed a foot above the base flood elevation. They've got the parking underneath. We have other examples of commercial structures. There's one just north of here on Brentwood Boulevard, the University Medical Club building, I believe, right next to the brewery, where if you swing around the back, you'll notice that there's actually a significant drop-off, and they've got the parking under the building to comply with floodplain regulations. So all of those items were put into the report, hopefully trying to provide the commission with some clarity on what some of these items actually look like instead of just talking about them. The only other point that I would make is staff did notice an error in the definition of substantial improvement under exception C. There's some language about that exception, and that is incorrect. That exception should say any improvement that does not require a permit under the applicable codes enacted by the city of Brentwood, instead of the reference to the repetitive loss structure.
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. It should say, so item C that's in the report should be crossed out in its entirety, and it should say any improvement that does not require a permit under the applicable codes enacted by the city of Brentwood. So in other words, if you don't need to pull a permit for work, it does not count in that calculation. It is exempt from that definition.
Are you referring to the proposed amendments to the ordinance?
Yes, sir.
Substantial improvement
For
definition.
the definition for substantial improvement, yeah.
Subsection C.
Subsection C, right.
So, Mr. Wise, for the benefit of the audience and the commission, remind us what the current state of the law is in Brentwood on when the duty to flood-proof these buildings is triggered.
So the buildings that we are talking about this evening are what we call pre-firm buildings generally. They are structures that are built in the 100-year floodplain that do not comply with current requirements. So that is, they are not flood-proofed or they are not elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Under our current regulations, if someone comes in to do an improvement in one of those structures and the value of that improvement is greater than 50% of the value of the structure, they have to come into compliance with current floodplain regulations. So it needs to either be flood-proofed for non-residential or elevated or flood-proofed. Or for non-residential, it can be flood-proofed or elevated. For residential, it needs to be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation. The proposed change that's in front of the commission this evening would alter that portion of how the floodplain regulations are administered, and it would say instead of it being a one-time calculation, that the city would cumulatively aggregate over some period of time improvements, and if that cumulative value is greater than 50% of the value of the structure, then they would need to come into compliance with flood regulations.
Okay. And should the commission and ultimately the Board of Aldermen adopt these new definitions, what would be the perceived benefit to the city?
Well, I think the initial and the most pressing issue would be we would have structures that are compliant with floodplain regulations, which protects property, which protects life, which has time and again been shown to be a legitimate public interest item. There is also a benefit of, there have been changes in federal policy to flood insurance rates. This change would further the city's goal of becoming a member community of the community rating system, which in addition to some of the benefits of the program itself from a federal level, would reduce property premium rates for insurance within the city of Brentwood.
Are we able to specifically identify what the premium savings would be?
We are not able to specifically identify what that would be at this time.
What is the cost to the city when there is a flood and buildings are damaged by flood?
I've looked into this quite a bit. I can't directly quantify what that is, but every time there's a flood, we've got emergency service personnel, whether it be our police officers or our firefighters that are going out. You know, the perfect example would be in 2008, which was a very severe flood. We had people that were, you know, rescuing people out of buildings. Those are generally city personnel that are spending our money and our overtime dollars and our equipment to aid in that process. We've got public works crews that are constantly involved in trying to help out. And then we've got the administrative side where we're trying to deal with the cleanup of it as well. So I don't have an exact value, but there is a cost in terms of the city's resources being spent to aid in that process.
Okay, very good. All right, let's debate this. I'll open up to the commission members. Mr. Demmett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak in favor of this proposed amendment to change the definitions. I think in order to fully appreciate what is being proposed, it's important to put it into context. For those of you who don't know the history of this, there's a program called the National Insurance Flood Program, which was enacted into law by President Nixon back late 60s, early 70s, thereabouts. And that was in response to a number of natural catastrophes, flooding, et cetera, where they found that a lot of the properties, both commercial and residential, had no flood insurance. So the federal government was coming in and bailing them out. And the federal government decided, you know, we can't do that anymore. We know they can't get insurance. The private sector is not going to write insurance for these properties. So the thought was, let's go ahead, if the federal government would provide insurance for these properties, and they do it on a reduced premium, a subsidized premium, because if the premium was going to actually cover the full risk, the property owners most likely would not be able to afford them. So the federal government said, we'll provide you insurance, number one, and we'll do it on a reduced premium, number two, and in return, what the city has to do is to put in an ordinance form some provision that would require these properties at some point in time to become compliant with the flood control measures. And that's where we are right now, is this 50% threshold. And as the chairman has already stated, or Mr. Wise has stated, as it currently stands, if there's an improvement of 50% or more, then that property, that's the threshold, that property has to become compliant, which would require either building it above the floodplain or making it floodproof through some other measure. What the federal government realized is that over 40 or 50 years, a lot of these properties still have not become flood compliant. It hasn't worked as intended. This was never intended to be a permanent solution, these reduced premiums. As anybody who deals in the insurance industry will understand, you cannot afford to collect reduced premiums on an anticipated risk. You'll go out of business. And in response to that, Congress in 2012 passed what's called the Bigger Waters Act, which was to address this problem with the National Flood Insurance Program. And the net result of that, obviously it's a long law, it was signed by President Obama in I think the fall of 2012, is that the Congress decided to eliminate these subsidized premiums. And so as the property owners for 40 or 50 years were getting this break of having low insurance premiums but getting full coverage, that's now been eliminated. And it doesn't take place overnight. In fact, I believe that it takes place, I think there's a 25% increase per year per piece of property until that premium accurately reflects and captures the risk of flood for that property. So what we're talking about is, in the materials handed out by Mr. Wise, there's on page 9, it gives you an example that the flood insurance rate, now this isn't something that Mr. Wise came up with, he got this, I believe, from FEMA. These are their numbers, it's on a hypothetical $100,000 piece of property. It's a $595 insurance premium, that's the subsidized rate. Then things take place and they go up to $3,090 premium. As you can see, that's a tremendous increase. So the federal government the thought is that since these property owners are not bringing them into compliance, and it is a simple code compliance issue as I see it, they're not doing it, let's try something else. And so the federal government, through this Bigger Waters Act, said let's let's eliminate the premiums. Maybe that would encourage the property owners to bring these properties into compliance. Because once they bring them into compliance, then obviously their premiums would drop substantially to accurately reflect the risk, and that being there really is no risk of any flood if they make them flood proof. What I think, the reason I'm in support of these two definition changes is, number one, what we have in front of us is an opportunity to address these increased premiums. I've heard a lot of stories about the increase, and it's rather substantial. If you look at just the materials that Justin provided us, that's a substantial increase for flood insurance. If we make these changes, then that allows us, that's part of us joining the CRS program. It's a voluntary program, it's not mandated, but it would result in some reduction of that increased premium. That's a benefit to the property owners in the flood zone. Keep in mind that their premiums are rising. We can't do anything about that. We'd be as successful in holding back those rising premiums as we would be in holding back the rising flood waters. Those are beyond our control. Those things are happening. What we can do is try to lessen that harsh effect on those property owners by making this change, by adopting this change. It provides some type of a reduction in the premium for the property owners. Secondly, another reason to make this change, aside from the effect of joining the CRS, is, quite frankly, I think it's time for these properties to become compliant. This is a federal program. When there's an event and claims are filed, it's federal tax dollars that are being used to bail them out. And they're not paying full premium. They're paying a subsidized premium, and federal taxes are going to take care of these properties. That needs to be eliminated. Secondly, city resources are being diverted. As Justin mentioned, when there's an event and these properties get inundated with water, we have police officers who have to respond, we have firemen who have to respond, Public Works has to go and clean this up. There certainly is a benefit to the city for not diverting these resources. And finally, there is a perception problem with this city that it's a flood area and there's nothing can be done about that. Well, if we make this change, the effect of it is it's going to require these property owners to bring their properties into compliance sooner rather than later. And that can change the perception then of people and businesses around the community. They won't look at Brentwood anymore necessarily as that's an area where you cannot build. What they can see is that is an area where you can build and you can make that piece of property more efficient. My concern is that if we don't make this change, then the federal government is going to come in and mandate this at some point in time. And at that point, will we still be able to join the CRS and provide the property owners with a reduced premium? I think this is a good time to do this. It's got the benefit of helping out the property owners. I think it's time for them to become compliant and bring these properties up to code.
Mr. Plufka.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wise, you had said in your opening remarks that we aren't able to calculate the reduction in premium that would be afforded by adopting these definitions. Why can't we? Is there something that we're missing from, I mean, isn't there some part of the federal regulation that explains to some extent a matrix or a model as to what the benefit would be?
Well, if there's something that's quite that simple, they haven't shared it with me.
Okay.
So there may be something out there, but the other part is, it's part of a larger calculation that's part of a larger effort to get this underway.
Does it have to do with what alterations are made and what compliance is provided, the nature of the compliance, the value of the property, the location of the property, that kind of thing? Or is it?
It's a much larger calculation on the total efforts of the city to address flooding issues.
The other question I had for you was, you had mentioned about the fact that every time there is a flood in Brentwood, 2008 being the most recent example you cited, that there is an expenditure of resources, EMS, police, and fire. Even if all the properties located in Brentwood were miraculously and suddenly compliant with this 100 flood year plan, wouldn't there still be some expenditure of police and fire and EMS in the event of a flood, regardless of whether the buildings contained within the floodplain were compliant?
Yes.
But in your estimation, there would be a savings.
It would be reduced. I mean, one of the tasks under our current regulations and under our current agreement that we have with the state and the federal government is that whenever there's a disaster event, we have to have personnel, our building official is charged with going out to each damaged structure and doing an evaluation and documenting each individual building and then submitting that back to the federal government, showing that, hey, we went in and we're doing the substantial damage evaluation after every event. So if there's...
Is it clear to you that that's an easier task in the event that we've got properties that are compliant with, or not compliant, but...
I mean, if buildings don't flood as often, we don't do that as often.
Or if they're built to the point where they can withstand a flood.
Exactly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and Mr. Wise, just to clarify, the city, should it enact all of the changes, the proposed changes, except for these two definitions, the city would still be a CRS city at that point?
Well, we would still be an eligible CRS community. Yeah. Regardless of which way we go, it's a process that we're working on that's been several months in the making already, and will take several more months until we get through it. But I think your point is correct that if we don't enact this, it does not remove us from eligibility for the community rating system.
And the city would still see some premium support, premium reduction in the event it would enact all of these changes except for those two definitions.
Well, all of the other changes, our current ordinance is what they refer to as a non-compliant ordinance. So all of those other minor changes are absolutely, they're not going to get us any credit. But if we don't do them, then we would jeopardize being removed from the National Flood Insurance Program, and flood insurance at all in the city would be jeopardized.
But in the event that the city enacts all of the proposed changes except for the two definitions,
right,
we're not jeopardizing our flood insurance eligibility.
That is correct.
And we will see some premium reduction?
Hopefully.
Just not as much as we would if we enacted the two definitions?
Correct.
And we have no idea how to quantify what the difference in the premium?
That is correct.
Okay, very good.
Commissioner, may I ask?
Yeah, sure, Ms. Hanson, sure.
Mr. Wise, something that I thought was probably one of the more compelling arguments I heard at our last meeting had to do with how the definition of substantial improvement affects commercial properties where landlords or owners are building out for a specific tenant and then are trying to white box it and having to make improvements, at the end of every lease term. I'm not sure from my review of these documents where or how you have addressed this, and does that remain a concern? I can't tell from what I've read that commercial owners are protected, and if they're not, that would make me hesitant and loath to.
I think the answer to your question is nothing has changed in the document that's before you. The document that you guys have before you tonight is the exact same document that was here in March. I think the counter to what I agree is a very good item to consider is if people are allowed to continuously invest in their property without ever having a trigger to bring it into compliance, then there's no point to have a trigger at all. Because if we're allowing them to continuously invest in tenants, how do you separate the tenant improvement from a building improvement?
Understandable, but I would think if you were a commercial property, you're going to hit that 50% threshold higher or more quickly and over. Or help me
I can say
understand.
over 40 years, it hasn't happened very often. I mean, we haven't seen that they're hitting that mark. So I think that while I think it's a logical point that you're making, I think that what we're seeing out in the field is counter to that, where we're seeing the buildings that are still sitting there 45 years later that have not hit that mark yet.
Okay, well, is there anything, just so that I'm clear, is there anything in the proposed definitions that would allay a concern of a commercial property owner about, the sentence that gets me is the first alteration of any wall, ceiling, floor, or other structural part commences, whether or not it affects the external dimensions of the building. Just seems poorly worded, or at least worded in a way that could have an unintended consequence. That's a big pause for me, and I'm just wondering how or if we can address that, or if
I think my very honest opinion would be that if we were to start trying to provide loopholes to allow for investment in the property, that it would be a better direction for the commission to go to not adopt the definition.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Mr. Demmett, go ahead.
In response to that, I think if we start looking at putting in some loopholes, I think we also run the risk of jeopardizing our standard with our participation in the NFIP. That's my concern because, as I mentioned, the NFIP, the federal government has said, here's the formula that you have to have codified, put in ordinance form. And if we start messing around with that, and there's an event, and the federal government pays out on it, then the federal government looks at our ordinance and says, wait a minute, you didn't do what you're supposed to do. So my concern is that they look back to us, to the city of Brentwood, to reimburse them for the payout. Because they said, here's the deal. You put this formula in your ordinance, then we will provide insurance and we'll do it on a subsidized premium. I don't think that we can make any change to their formula without running the risk of participating in the NFIP and invalidating the insurance coverage to begin with. Secondly, Justin, was there any discussion, Jennifer reminded me that in the last meeting we talked about there being maybe a distinction between commercial properties and residential properties. Have you had a chance to look at that?
I did. I was able to get confirmation that if the city chose to distinguish between those, that would be acceptable still to the state and federal government.
So we could have this apply strictly to commercial property and exclude those 13 or 12 residential pieces of property.
That is correct.
Can I just make one quick point? I'm not suggesting that there should be some sort of loophole in the ordinance for a commercial property owner. What I'm suggesting is that if we're going to live or die by wording in an ordinance or in a statute, it should be clear to the people who are going to have to abide by that what it means. And as I read this, I have, as an attorney, but as a citizen, I have a real issue with the wording here and what the heck it means, and how it protects or how it fails to protect the residents of our community. And so I don't know if there's a way to allay that concern.
Mr. Plufka.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Jennifer, does it help that when we talked about subsection C, that we're talking about only permitted improvements?
When I'm looking at, so instead
So
of the
in other words,
repetitive
if you're talking
loss-
about first alteration of a wall, ceiling, floor, or other structural part, if you're talking about, I think one of your concerns was you could apply that to anything, including things like paint. But if we're talking only about permitted under subsection C, if we're only talking about permitted improvements, does that give you any more comfort with regard to that first definitional section?
No, I appreciate you pointing that out to me. And in terms of paint versus a build out, or having to white box something back to its original form so that a new tenant can come in, I'm not sure it still makes it any less more compelling. But I appreciate you pointing it out.
So
Thank you.
are you asking if there's a way that we could essentially flush that out and say that it includes the cost of A, B, C, D, E, and strictly define exactly what's in that cost.
Yeah, I don't know that I have the solution. I just know that if I put myself into the shoes of a commercial property owner and I read that language, it would be very disconcerting to me because I'm not sure how to apply it or what, whether it would disincentivize me from making improvements or it would hurt, the quality or the tenure of my tenants. I don't know. And I'm just sort of speaking out of turn, but I suspect that some of my concerns are probably shared by the audience. So I'm asking questions for understanding.
And I think that I don't have a good solution that
Okay.
would still keep the goal of what this change is trying to do and address that comment.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Bilderbeck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, when you deal with change, and that's what we do here, and we change regulations all the time. When you deal with change, and we change regulations all the time, and that's what we do here. Is that better? Okay. Thank you. You're welcome. So when you deal with change, it can be problematic and challenging for folks. It can be scary for folks. I think that Mr. Dimmitt did an excellent job of outlining the history of the floodplain regulations in the country. I think that also, as I mentioned at our last meeting, we've had other local efforts that have been going in this direction as well, related to stormwater requirements and detention. For 18 years, I worked for the St. Louis Home Builders Association, and I'm not speaking for them tonight, and I don't work there anymore. But I represented the interest of commercial developers, residential developers, future home buyers. I spent a great deal of time and energy representing those interests on floodplain regulations and development interest in the floodplain. And going through those time periods, I think that some of the arguments we made were valid. I think some of the arguments we made were a little weaker than others, let's say. And in making those arguments over time, it was clear that the community was going in a certain direction for the societal interest. It involved a balance of property rights, and it involved a balance of environmental protection. It involved a balance of taxpayer dollars. And as Mr. Dimmitt outlined on the federal aspect, we saw that here locally. We saw it when probably 1992 or so, MSD really started debating their stormwater requirements. 1993 when they passed, and as they spread all through like wildfire through the St. Louis metropolitan region. And we saw increasing floodplain regulations through all the municipalities. Some communities were much further behind in adopting those, but generally these things started to move pretty quickly. So it was all over the media. It was on the evening news. It was on the 10 o'clock news. I was on the news. It was in all the newspapers. I mean, this has been an issue that's been for a long time. I brought up last time the example of the gravel driveways when we made that change. Folks didn't want to have to make that investment because putting in a concrete driveway could be very expensive, and it was. But we made that change anyway. We've said you can't have metal siding on buildings that abut residential property, and boy, the commercial folks and the landlords were really up in arms about that. And, we did it anyway. And some of those things weren't, the easiest decisions to make because they impact people. And, we are the city of warmth, but we're also the city of fiscal responsibility and balancing taxpayer and societal interests with the interest of individual property rights. Today, I can't go out and do anything that I want with my property without getting a permit, without coming under compliance for a lot of different regulations, and really, to me, this is no different. I think after we've been dealing with something for such a period of time, that we owe it to ourselves and to the community to actually make the change and see that it actually is followed through with, to see that the properties are compliant, and not just in the interest of, well, in so many different interests, in the interest of the safety of the workers who have to go out and extract people from buildings during flooding, from the surrounding property values, not just those that are in the floodplain, but what about all those compliant properties? When you have property sales and it sells for a certain amount of money, or you have properties around you that aren't maybe up to the current compliant building code standards, it absolutely affects the property values of the surrounding properties. So to me, we're not just talking about the properties in the floodplain. We're not just talking about the properties that aren't compliant. We're talking about an impact on all the other surrounding properties. And, you know, then there's the impact on the rest of the taxpayers for the city. There's the impact on, you know, I pay federal taxes. I pay state taxes. I pay city taxes. I've been a resident of Brentwood since 1991 or 92. When we look at the commercial property owners, the way that I look at it is they know what the regulations are. They've seen that this is coming. You can't have been a resident in St. Louis region over the last 25 years and not have picked up in an inkling that this was happening. You know, is it going to be easy? No, maybe not. But if you can continually afford to do improvements to your property, you should be able to afford to floodproof it. And if you can't have your building up to code, then maybe you might need to reevaluate what you're doing with your property. But I don't think it's up to the I don't think that it's up to the rest of everyone else to continually fund, see these properties flooded, carry the burden, because it's not my responsibility to carry it. I think that, you know, when we look at the building code definitions, kind of getting back to your question, yeah, I've worked with building codes for 18 years when I was with the home building industry. I worked with the floodplain ordinances. And this language is standard, and anybody in the development industry and the building industry is going to know what it means. So I am speaking in support of this, and specifically for during the life of the building.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Mr. Norrenberger?
I have a couple of questions. Justin, what happens at the sale of the property? Does somebody, do they have to bring it up to code at that time if they just sold it now?
No.
No, there's no provision for a sale of property to bring it up to code.
Correct.
So what, like requirement for occupancy, the city comes in and you make them do certain things for bringing it up to code or whatever, and that causes them to go over that 50% mark. How would that affect us as a city trying to regulate them having their improvements? You know, you would be asking them to go over that 50% allowance over time.
It depends on what the requirement is. There is a provision that basically says if there is an item that is regulated to handle, you know, direct life safety issues, that there is an exemption possible for that.
Like a sprinkler system or something. Most of them probably have those already.
Well, I mean, a sprinkler system would fall under the improvement category, but there are exemptions when, like, if you literally have a building falling over, and there's something that needs to be done to get up to, you know, keep it from the immediate impending issues, that those things can be addressed through exceptions. Aside from that, you know, if they need to make improvements to bring it up to code, it would fall under that 50%.
The other question I had was regarding instead of talking about the first responders coming out. It's going to happen every time. But Executive Walk Apartments, who paid for the demolition and the removal of that site, and who bought the property?
The property was donated to the city.
From who?
From the property owner, the previous property owner.
Okay.
The city, we did have some minor funds that were used in the title search and basically some of the formality in the transfer of the property to the city. But that was largely a donation process. As far as the construction or the demolition of it, that has primarily or wholly been funded. The city's paid for it and we're being reimbursed through MSD for flood relief funding.
About how much would that be, just tearing that building down?
$300,000 for those 5 buildings?
But the city is being reimbursed for sure, or
Yeah. Yes.
they've told you they're going to reimburse?
Right.
So that's all I had, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Plufka?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Wise, sorry to do this, to keep
No.
doing this to you. If we don't adopt this definitional language, but adopt the balance of the changes to bring our statute or our ordinance into compliance, is it my understanding, my understanding correct that since 2012, when the new law went into effect, the federal law went into effect, that already property owners with ordinances like ours are seeing increases in their rates for insurance already, or has that not come to pass yet?
It has come, and it's coming somewhat in waves, it appears.
Do you have any information as to what that increased experience might be?
I can speak to specifically to a small couple examples that I've heard, but on a larger scale, it's going to be property by their actual risk. So I've heard some of the, I'm talking with a property owner on Manchester Road, east of Brentwood on the south side. They've got a little under a quarter acre, 5,000 square foot building. Their property or their insurance rates just went up to $17,000 a year.
From what, when it wasn't reduced?
I don't know what it was prior to that.
Okay. So but that $17,000 represented an increase?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, I mean,
So regardless of whether we adopt this language, if we don't adopt this language, well, even if we do, the premiums, the subsidy that had been in effect
Right.
since the Nixon administration to most recently 2012 is done,
well, they're looking.
or it's being phased out.
You're right. I was going to say they're looking particularly for residential. They're phasing it out over a couple of years, or if there's a change in ownership. So they're changing it slowly, but the transition is in process or done for some.
And so on a theoretical level, these definitional changes will provide folks who are experiencing an increase in premiums to allow for a somewhat of a reduction in that rate of increase.
Correct.
And we don't know what those ratios are necessarily.
Correct.
Okay. So even if we adopt the balance of the language, which we've all debated, and don't adopt the definitional stuff that's in there, these property owners could, theoretically at least, be pushed financially to make these changes, just because if they don't, the offering of flood insurance is going to become so prohibitively expensive that it's going to make those renovations somewhat cost effective for them.
Potentially, yeah.
And if you're carrying a note on a piece of property, you're required to have flood insurance if your property is located within the flood zone.
If it's
Is
a
that right?
federally backed mortgage, yes.
Okay, which is what
Right.
percentage of mortgages are those?
Right.
Right. So unless you own the property outright, and if you own the property outright, you can take the chance of not having flood insurance.
Absolutely.
And even if we adopt this ordinance, would they still have the opportunity to not have flood insurance?
Correct.
Thank you. That's all the questions I had.
All right, here's my take on this. This is a significant departure from the status quo. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think if we're going to make such a significant departure, there needs to be a compelling and a substantiated reason to do so. I think the aim is worthy. I'm just not seeing a compelling and substantiated rationale to make this significant departure from the status quo. We have no idea what the premium impact is going to be if we make these changes. We have no idea what sort of impact there's going to be on development on that corridor. And I think it's pretty clear that the imminent result will be a disincentivization to do development along that corridor, at least at the outset. To Mr. Demit's point, if we had some evidence, if we had some facts that showed that the government was going to pull the flood insurance program, I think that would be a compelling reason. We don't have that. We have no rationale, we have no evidence that this is going to have any impact on access to flood insurance. And then you get to Ms. Hansen's point, the fact that tenant build-out, simply changing the interior of a property to make it more suitable for a new tenant, would somehow go against this 50% and have an impact on value, potentially triggering this flood-proofing. So I rise in opposition to the two definitions, everything but the two definitions. It's not with prejudice. I think this could be an issue that could come up in the future to the extent we find out, we get substantiation of what the premium impact is going to be. We find out if the federal government is going to yank this flood insurance program. We have some changes. We have some leeway where we can make some of the changes that Ms. Hansen's referring to, or if we get some evidence that it's somehow going to support and encourage development along that corridor. As it is, I'm just not seeing a compelling and a substantiated basis to depart so significantly from the status quo. Any other commission members like to speak on this before we open it up to the audience?
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Mr. Demme.
Just a couple of points that you raised. Number one, the disincentive. I think the disincentive is in effect right now, and that is the 50% threshold as it stands. Exhibit A, look at Brentwood Industrial. There's been no redevelopment, no development down in that area. And that's because of the way that the federal government wrote the law back in the late 60s. This 50% threshold, it provided a way for property owners to skirt around that threshold and to put only a 49% or 48% threshold. That's not the goal. The goal is for the federal government to get out of writing insurance policies for these pieces of property and using taxpayer dollars to bail them out whenever there's an event. If we make this change, that's the incentive. They see that it is going to have to be done. They're going to hit that 50%. They can't get around the 50% like they can right now. So I look at it a little differently than you do. I think there's a disincentive right now to develop the property. And again, if you look at that property, it's been sitting there for 40 or 50 years with no changes. If we don't make this change, if we don't add this word cumulative, this definitional change to the ordinance, then 40 or 50 years from now, it's going to look just like it does right now. It's going to continue to be flooded, and we're going to continue to have the same problems that we've had ever since the beginning of time.
Okay. All right. Would any member of the audience like to address the commission on this application? Please step forward, state your name, your address, and your point.
Gene Holtzman with Hutkin Development Company. Our office is at 10829 Olive and Creve Coeur. We manage and represent the ownership of over 200,000 square feet of commercial property in Brentwood. And I have a nice, organized, sort of bullet-pointed presentation that I'm going to set aside, because I want to address and try to respond to some of the kinds of comments that were made here tonight that are only increasing our alarm about what is occurring. I agree entirely. There's seems to be a momentum from passing an ordinance and making a decision with a lack of any kind of quantified information at any level. I don't think that, including how many buildings, which has not been discussed here, can't comply. There's a sort of characterization that seems to be taking place that we're sort of hiding our heads in the sand from the fact that we exist in a 100-year floodplain. We know that, but that's the reality. That's the reality that was when those were developed and what took place at the time under codes that existed at the time. Now we have the reality. We're not simply trying to skirt or avoid commercial property owners. We are, Hutkin Development Company is maintains, I think most people would recognize by reputation or having seen the properties directly. The absolute highest standards of maintenance, of improvements, of upgrading of properties. We're not in any way avoiding improvement and expense that makes good economic sense, that preserves the property, that enhances the property, and hopefully has benefit to the community and the excuse me, and the business activity within Brentwood. Part of what is so alarming to me is that the idea that exceptions would be loopholes. There are in most ordinances, and actually in some related to the flood hazard ordinances in other cities, that build in exceptions because they make sense, because it's common sense, because it's reasonable. It's not a way of trying to find a way out. It's a way to deal with certain economic and physical realities. I will tell you right now, it should be no secret, and I actually think that it should be something that is recognized and understood as part of this discussion. And further alarming that it's not. You can't flood-proof Brentwood Industrial. Can't be done. That's right. You can't do it. It's not like, okay, finally after all these years, you're going to put something in place that makes it happen. You're not.
Why can't you? Tell us why.
Because you can't raise the finished floors above the floodplain. You would have to demolish the building. You can't. I would imagine that there's some scenario of if you spent a dozen times the value of the building, that maybe you could jack it up and pour new foundation. But in any real terms, that is in any reasonableness standard, not loophole standard, just physically, economically feasible that makes sense, that it can't be done. We had an engineer just to validate what we thought was the case. I will tell you I won't tell you what his response was. It can't be done. You can't retrofit these buildings to make them comply with what physically can't be done. And I fundamentally, absolutely, completely disagree with the underlying premise of almost the complete, to the extent that there is an argument and rationale on your side. I challenge the premise. It's not going to achieve what you want. All you will do is create a situation that makes punitive investing in any way that maintains, improves the quality, the character of the property. All you will do is create a dynamic where every time we put in money for an improvement or for a new tenant or for anything that really, this would be the first time where we have anything where there is an ordinance that makes us live in a state of anxiety about being quality operators and maintainers of real estate. We can't have the risk. We will do everything possible, because the other thing that doesn't get discussed, well, what happens if you can't do it? What are the implications, the ramifications, the issues that have not even been raised as part of this conversation of that fact that it does not exist only in our small handful of buildings, has not even been discussed. Now I want to make a couple of points clear, and I want to also understand a couple of things. It was said that the issue and the debate was primarily around the whole matter of defining substantial improvements. It's part of it. The other part of it is the cumulative program. That we will, that's where the disincentive for appropriate business, real estate maintenance, investment, and things that really do better the community. You will see, and I am so convinced of this, and I normally use the word potential, I soften things, I qualify things. I don't have to in this case. You will see a deterioration and degradation of the properties that you think that you are trying to bring up to code standards. It's not, it won't achieve the goal. And then you also, in talking in terms of, without quantifying, when you're talking about saving $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 of totally hypothetical, I haven't heard any information that makes me feel that that's credible, known information at this point. But the idea of saving that and putting at risk either having to abandon a property or having to invest 10 times that amount. So this whole idea of loopholes, I challenge the whole way of even the implications towards what we do as property owners. We have over 2 million square feet of property in over a dozen different cities, and we work with the cities. We believe 100% that it's always better to work with than against, and to try to find common ground, common goals, and try to get there together, rather than at ways that work at odds. I'll bring this to a conclusion very quickly. I think that you will see a decline in the type of tenants, in the quality of the properties, in the maintenance of the properties, and talk about the effect of flooding on adjacent surrounding areas. That is like a contagion. If you have pockets of subpar, maintained condition properties, as is deals for tenants, because now we had a tenant recently who put $1 million in 10,000 square feet in a different city. Under this ordinance, absolutely great quality user, a 26,000 square foot building that was probably equal to the value, half the value of the building, right? That one improvement. Great user, 10-year lease. Under this ordinance at our properties in Brentwood, we'd say, can't do it. We would lose quality tenants. You would lose quality tenants. It would go the other direction because it's a situation where the owners couldn't risk what you think you're forcing them to do because they can't do it. And I have to say, honestly, with that risk, with the devaluing process, you're going to have, I tend not to be too paranoid, you're going to have this domino effect, this chain reaction. People aren't going to be able to get mortgages. Banks are not going to want to do financing of commercial building or refinancing. The risk is too great. There's going to be no market for it. They would be unsellable for buildings that physically or economically simply can't comply. It would be devastating, and I think that I haven't heard recognition of that. I think that your comments about public policy, sure, but discomfort is not a measure of how good public policy is. That it has to take into account, quantified, completely understood, what are the costs, what are the damages, and what are the realities. And I think that the only way that I can think of to address it is two. One is that the whole cumulative substantial improvement trigger goes away. You wouldn't be the first. In our research of other cities that actually in the St. Louis metropolitan area, as best as we know, nobody has it. And nobody's in, except for St. Charles County, nobody has that in place. And St. Charles County, it's just in rural districts without any dense development. The city of St. Charles doesn't have it. Kirkwood dropped out of the program. And the city of Kansas City, has their list of loopholes, reasonable exceptions based on need and cause and feasibility, is as long as the ordinance. So you're asking to take this absolute extreme with, I don't think, a full recognition of what the implications really are. Now, obviously, because this is such an important issue to our owners, our investors, the other people we talk to, I sound pretty passionate tonight. I was a little bit milder last time. But I want you to know, when I said that we have in a dozen or more cities where we work closely with the city, maybe that's what we do. Maybe we look at together in some kind of partnership, cooperative way, public-private, that's when things happen. We're not the bad guys. We're not trying to make Brentwood a worse place or say, well, we don't care about the flood because, the Brentwood police will come out. We would like to see improvements. But we really wonder, without being civil engineers or experts, maybe there's a way of addressing it better at the source. Maybe there's ways of focusing more, of getting rid of this whole cumulative substantial improvement trigger that is so dangerous, and looking more at what can be done to improve stormwater, floodwater, drainage capacity and systems to see. I don't know what could be done, but it certainly seems like it could be a way that we would work together. It also seems like as we would explore that, maybe there's all sorts of funding mechanisms that could take place with that. Local, state, federal, FEMA related. We are absolutely so totally convinced, and every property owner we have talked to is, that we've talked to, which hasn't been everybody, that this is a backfiring concept and ordinance that would cause much more harm than good. And so obviously, you know, our recommendation, our urging is to drop this cumulative measure, and we would just want the opportunity to work and explore other alternatives. Maybe there's some better way that finds common ground, that makes sense, that protects interests and advances goals together. And we're sincere about that. We do it all the time. We work with cities constantly in brainstorming and hashing out ways to do that. Thank you. I appreciate you listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Holtzman.
Mr. Holtzman?
Mr. Plufka, do you have a thought?
Thank you. Mr. Holtzman, could you return to the podium? I have a couple questions for you. Sure. Thanks. My first question was, you understand that the way the ordinance is right now, that the scenario you described of the investment in the other community would have triggered this ordinance because you said yourself it was 100% increase in the value of the property.
About 50%.
Okay, well 50% is the current static test.
It's an extreme example, and I do realize that, and I do think that is...
Hyperbole aside, let's talk about something else. Because I understand what you're saying. Since 2012, then, when the subsidies have been phased out, in the properties that you have in Brentwood, in the properties that you have in the floodplain, have you seen an increase in your premiums?
No.
You haven't?
No. Not a penny. No. They've been steady. That's why I'm not sure. We're pretty well informed, and we have a specialist in commercial real estate who's our broker. And among all of the things that we have to investigate further is that.
So, your experience in the last 2 years, or at least the last premium cycle, is that there's been no change.
If it is, it's so nominal, so marginal, it doesn't mean a thing.
But you understand the legislation that went into effect in 2012 that has this aggregate notion that every time there is an loss experience, it will no longer be subsidized, but that the new legislation itself takes that out of the equation.
I understand.
So that there's at least the potential. Let me finish.
I'm sorry.
There's just a potential for increase, even though you haven't seen it. My only question in bringing it up is, given your position with regard to the triggers, the accumulated triggers and things like that, being against them, do you think it's better if we, with regard to those kinds of standards, do nothing, eliminate that from whatever ordinance we enact, and let the market, to some extent, with at least the theoretical removal of this subsidy that's been in place for decades, that will ultimately sort of set the bar. In other words, if the premiums don't go up, then we're still where we are right now, and development goes along as it's been going along or hasn't, and there is no real change in the way things are. But as premiums might spike, or if they do spike, I don't know if they will or not, but if they do, because this subsidy's been removed, that, of course, will at some point become its own incentive. If it's possible, and as you say, there's property that, whether you're incentivized or not, it's impractical, or at least it's financially impossible because of its prohibitive cost.
Or physically, too. There are situations where you just can't.
Right, and I don't mean to be flippant, but I mean, there's alternatives to renovating an existing structure to bringing it into compliance. There's other things that can be done. New buildings can be built, on those places. I'm not suggesting that needs to be done, but I'm just saying, just because a building in and of itself is not engineered that it can be raised, if that's the only way to flood-proof it, then I understand your point 100%. What I'm trying to get my mind around, and I'm leaning towards what Mr. Daming had said at the end of our the commentary that we had made. I just want to understand the whole of this problem, that property owners, for the most part, as way I read the legislation, have lost a subsidy that they have had for decades. Now, whether that's actually provided some sort of impact yet, apparently it hasn't, and maybe it won't. But I'm just trying to get my head around the idea that perhaps the best way to go here is to simply ignore the section that is offensive, the section about the cumulative and the definitional section that we're discussing tonight, and simply recommend for Alderman to approve this ordinance and let things go about the way they are and let the market sort of take care of itself.
You know, I don't have any kind of intelligent, meaningful answer to that, unfortunately, because I think we understand the concerns, the problems of what's in front of us right now with this proposal. We don't know what the answers and solutions are. I know that on the legislation that you're talking about, as far as on the surface of it, as you describe it, but I know that with any legislation, the devil is in the details.
Sure.
And so without knowing what those details are, what phases in, what regional areas, what exceptions there are, 100, 150, without knowing, I mean, if it's typical legislation, it's probably, 2,000 pages of details and rules. I don't know. I mean, that's part of why I would love to slow it down and talk through and try to explore those kinds of questions of what we do. I do know that I still think that our flood insurance has not gone up yet. I think you're right. There would certainly be market realities you would have to face if it was phased out, if it wasn't subsidized, if it was increased.
Right.
But I still go back to the same point, which is, but I don't know that this really solves that problem. I don't know that it really...
I'm not saying it does. I'm talking about it as an alternative to going forward. And in other words, if the subsidized flood insurance didn't incentivize people because of practicalities, because of, as you say, in some instances, impossibilities to renovate this property so that it's flood proof, to whatever that means. This was an effort from another direction. This being this cumulative,
A completely unhelpful response would be to that is that those are the kinds of things that we would really like to sit down and discuss, to see if we can, when we bring our two perspectives and knowledge together, when we bring the things together from the city's point of view that we don't have. We're looking at this not just out of self-interest. We're trying to understand the more global set of complicated consequences of it. But we're open. I mean, we're wanting to. We would love to see if there's some way. I mean, it's really easy to say. So but I don't know that that's possible either. But it certainly would be if we could improve the capacity of the whole runoff system, because I don't know how many events there are like this. But I will say this: even the event that we keep referring to of 2008, by every definition that I understand, that was a flash flood. That you had 6 inches of water over the course of 3 hours, and my understanding is 4.5 inches of that occurred within 45 minutes. It was Hurricane Ike. It was like the most amazing downpour that any of us have experienced. And I don't know that is the event that all things should then be, that is the reference point for making dramatic changes in how the flood hazard insurance program and ordinances are changed.
Because it wasn't serious enough? Is that?
Huh?
Because it wasn't serious?
No, I didn't say that at all.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry. I'm glad you asked that question. Not at all. What I'm saying is that because it was a flash flood, it's a sort of contained, isolated, extreme event that I don't know that was record rainfall. What I'm saying is that I don't know that as a reference point in the most extreme of conditions anymore, if there was an F5 tornado that went through all of St. Louis to say tear down St. Louis. It's a horrible, tragic, costly event, but I'm not sure that a flash flood of that level and that rarity is the point to use to begin to change everything from. I don't know. I mean, as I said when I was here last time, I still have a lot of questions, and that's part of what I'm suggesting that we begin the process of, is working on that.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Holtzman.
Thank you.
Any other member of the audience like to address the commission? Yes, sir.
Good evening. For the record, my name's Stephen L. Kling Jr. I'm an attorney with Jenkins and Kling PC. I represent several of the property owners. They've asked me to speak, and I'm not going to repeat what Mr. Holtzman said. I think he did a good job talking about those issues. What I'm going to talk about is the community rating system. And first of all, the community rating system has been around since 1990. It's not something new. And what it does, just by what its name implies, is it provides a rating system. And the rating system puts you in various classes based on points. And in the class that you're in, sets forth what the savings is with respect to the premiums on insurance. For example, for properties like in your area, which are zoned an AE, the savings go from 0 to 45%, but you've got to get points up to over 4,500 points to get up to that level. For instance, if you get less than 500 points, you get no savings. So there's this ladder approach. And why that's important is that there are lots of different ways to get points. First of all, there's a total of almost 15,000 points that you can get that would be eligible to helpfully save insurance premium savings. The points that you get based on the chart for the cumulative substantial improvements is 90 points out of almost 15,000. For example, if you did flood mapping, a new basic study, you get 290 points. If you did a higher study, you do get 160 points. There are things on here that don't apply, like dams and levees, but there's a whole host of things. Plan implementation, community assessment, these things all get you points as well. So the thing that you're going to get by adding this cumulative definition, this huge savings from the flood insurance premiums, is not going to be true. You really could get a lot more points by doing a lot of other things. Also, I want to share with you this map. And hopefully you can see it, but if you look at the pink areas, those are all the communities that are not in the, it looks like you all have it, not in the rating system. There are only 5 that are, and they all border either the Mississippi or the Missouri River, and in most cases, they're more rural focused. So, and they obviously did have some severe floods that wiped out all sorts of houses. So I think it's important to take that into account. And as already mentioned, and we're happy to provide you the information, the ones that even do have this, they don't have a 10-year, they don't have a lifetime. The couple that have cumulative at all in the rural areas have a 5-year. So what you're talking about is a very drastic change. Anyway, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Kling.
Good evening. My name is Lindsay Renlin. I'm with McCarthy, Leonard, and Kammerer. Brian McGovern from our office, I believe, spoke at the last meeting. He apologizes. He cannot be here tonight. But we represent DDR Corp., which is the parent company of GS Brentwood LLC, which is the entity that owns Brentwood Promenade. Not to belabor the points that have been made here tonight, we certainly adopt and agree with all of the comments that have been made previously. I believe you do have a letter in your board packets dated April 4th from our office detailing DDR's position on the proposed revisions to the ordinance. I simply add one additional point of concern that DDR has with regard to the proposed ordinance revisions, and that would be the ordinance revisions do not address properties such as the Promenade at Brentwood that are partially within the floodplain and partially not. It's our position that DDR and similar properties should not then be forced to comply with floodproofing portions of their property that are not in the floodplain. We certainly are open to any questions that the commission may have for DDR, but again, we certainly adopt the comments that have already been made here tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Renlin.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm Fred Epstein. Our family bought a property in Hanley Industrial Court in 1956. and we've enjoyed being in Brentwood. I've since sold the business to somebody else, but the property remains. Our family still owns the real estate. So I go back a long way, and I've seen a lot of changes, mostly changes to the better. And I really can't speak to the commercial and residential properties because I'm not familiar with those. But I can tell you that, first of all, Hanley Industrial Court is now misnamed because there's very little industrial activity that goes on there now. It is really ripe for redevelopment into office space and whatever. But industrial activity has moved out of Brentwood some time ago. And in fact, I was instrumental in putting together a Hanley Industrial Court Association many years ago, which is now in the process of being revived by a number of property owners who are in the area. And while they're looking at some sort of cosmetic changes, such as changing the name and improving the landscaping and so on and so forth, the flooding has been a problem ever since we bought the property. So I think rather than trying to concentrate on what various business owners might do with their properties to flood-proof them, I believe it would be wiser if this board looked at ways of either containing the floodwaters. I know when we built a building, 20, 30 years ago down the street from the headquarters, and at that time we put in what amounted to a swimming pool under the property to catch the floodwaters and store them and then let them trickle out slowly into Black Creek. And I would really urge you to think in those terms, because without that, the area obviously needs redevelopment. And without some way of retaining those floodwaters, it's not going to happen. And various property owners have various problems. It's not just a matter of making the doors flood-proof. There's much more involved in the sewer system and so forth. So that's the main message I would like to leave with you tonight. I've been through, I came into the business in 1957, and so I've enjoyed a long career and a long time in Brentwood. I think it's a terrific place. The location couldn't be better. And it's no wonder to me that industrial activity has moved out, because the property is really, as the metropolitan area has expanded and the highway system has been improved, the property is really worth much more, both to the city and to the individual property owners. But it has to be, you have to, I think, look at a much broader plan to bring that area into its full potential. Be glad to answer your questions. Otherwise, I'll sit down.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein.
Good evening. My name is Peter Von Gontard, and I represent some of the property owners, specifically at 8500 Manchester. And the comments from the audience obviously reflect many of our property owners' views, but I had just a couple of questions that weren't addressed. one of the things that was mentioned is the purpose of the change is to protect property and life. And the first question I had was, of all the floods that we've had down there, and we've had a few where our property has been threatened, who's died? The second is, when they talk about protecting the property, we've never received a dime from Brentwood, nor the federal government, to improve our property. We've gone in, we've done the repairs, and those have always been on us. It's our risk, and we've paid for it. As far as I know, Brentwood has never paid for it. On the emergency crews going out, if we do this change, and now the properties are developed, and they're surrounded by floodwater, are we not going to rescue the people? We're going to tell the police and firemen, nope, leave them there. Of course, we're still going to go in and rescue those people. Flood debris and cleaning up after floods, we've always paid to clean up our own flood debris. Brentwood has never paid for the flood debris of our properties. We've paid for it. If there's flood debris from upstream, which is what's going to be on the public property, is Brentwood now not going to pick that up because they think it's not going to be there? Changing this is not going to change any of that. I had a question of this savings that Mr. Weiss referred to. If this goes in, is the board suggesting that the police budgets will go down because we don't need as many emergency responders, policemen? Fire going to go down? Public services going to go down? We're going to save any money for Brentwood if this goes in? I don't think so. I hadn't heard any of the property owners that spoke tonight said they got federal money, tax money from the federal government that somehow we're costing them, because it doesn't seem to me we are. We improve our property. I have a question of, if we're going to be required to lift ours out so that there's not a flood that the people have to go into, is Brentwood going to raise the roads so that people can drive through so that they don't have that flood issue? Because that's something, that we could say, raise those roads then. Raise the property around, not ours, if we're required to do so. The last question I have, are any of the members of the board owners of commercial property in the floodplain that are affected by these changes? None? That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Von Gonter.
My name is John Beck. I have a property at 2715 Mercantile. It's down in the floodplain, which we've owned since '85. And when we bought the property, we were not aware that it was in a floodplain. And I guess it was permitted years ago to build there by Brentwood. Perhaps they knew it was a floodplain and built it there anyway, but perhaps they didn't. But as far as the value of the property in round numbers would be $1 million. We paid $800,000 for it in the 80s. As things go, it should be worth $1.5 million, but because of the economy and the floodplain, et cetera, I would value the property at maybe $1 million. Some of the things we've done and we need to do, a roof on that building is $150,000. Parking lots could be $100,000. The landscaping could easily be $50,000. It's coming up, and we've got prices on that. And that's not including renters' improvements. If somebody moves out and you have to refit the building, that could go into $100,000. I'm right there, so I'm up at $100,000, at $500,000 on $1 million property. And this building is 35,000 square feet, and it's all concrete block and concrete, and there's no picking it up. I don't know what you're thinking about as far as flood-proofing this building. It just isn't going to happen. We've been there since the 80s, and we've seen water in the streets, we've seen floods, we've seen this and that. Nothing like '08. That was quite a flood, and I think possibly the 100-year flood, I'm hoping. But as far as creating an administrative nightmare for your city, what do you consider basis as a price for the building, and what is the 50%? Who's going to keep track? Are you people in the building department going to know that I put $100,000 in this year, and 3 years later I'm going to do another 100, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that? Is somebody going to come up to me and say, You know, you're at the limit here, and now you're going to have to pick your building up, which absolutely cannot be done. I feel like we are down at sort of the neglected end of Brentwood in a way. I feel like sort of the redheaded stepchild, the way it looks down there, it's a mess, the sidewalks. I just don't care for the way it's been maintained, and I feel like a patient with an illness and your solution is to shoot me, okay? It just doesn't feel like a helpful thing that's going on here. I'm trying to get renters. I can't believe that I kept my renters after the flood. I really can't. Those people did not move out, and there's a lot of open property around this city, and they stuck in there. One of my renters put $300,000 in his refit of his building after the flood. And how am I going to entice people to come and rent my building? That's what's really important to me. And that the place looks nice. It's a flash flood. It comes up, it goes down. I don't know, you know, what the solution is. I think putting a cap on things is going to be difficult for us and impossible to govern for you all. Trying to figure out what a basis is and what is 50% of that basis and who's going to keep track of the incremental raises going on to all these buildings that are in the floodplain. That's pretty much what I have to say. Anybody that could come down and tell me how to flood-proof my building and do it economically, I think it would be a catastrophe for me. Personally, it would be a 100% loss. There's nothing I can do with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beck.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Dempsey.
A couple of quick points I feel need to be addressed because they've come up a few times now, and it's this statement, unsupported statement, that this would require buildings to be elevated 1 foot above the floodplain. No one up here tonight has said that that was a requirement. In fact, Mr. Wise said that would be an option for commercial real estate or flood-proof the property. Isn't that correct, Justin? For commercial.
Correct.
Okay, so I get to talk right now. Now, so my point is, it's not that we're suggesting that these concrete structures have to be raised 1 foot. I understand that can't be done. But I'm not an engineer, I'm not an architect. I've done my homework. I've looked at what FEMA has suggested, and I see that there are ways to flood-proof commercial properties other than physically lifting them. That's a way to do it. Now, so I want we got the record straight on that part.
I don't think the record is straight because I don't know if we're trying to find flood.
Well, hang on, sir. We do need to give him some respect here. Mr. Demeter, do you know how the floodproofing would take place?
Based on what I've read, you can construct a berm around the property. There's construction materials that can be used for doors and windows, and again, that's not my expertise. I don't know how to do it. Right. I'm just telling you there are ways. People smarter than me or anybody else up here know of ways to do that. And the bit about the flooding of Manchester Road, that's comparing apples to oranges. That has nothing to do with this. Manchester Road floods. There's no property damage to Manchester Road. There's no bailout of Manchester Road. That's not what we're talking. We're talking about damage to commercial property and trying to eliminate that. And I understand the reluctance to look back to 2008, but that's the best number to look at because that was the real flooding event. And if you look at the chart that Justin included, it shows that Brentwood far exceeded any other area in St. Louis County for damage to commercial pieces of property by almost 140 to almost 40. That's a huge difference. Brentwood has a real problem with commercial pieces of property getting damaged by floods. Now, the federal government wants to get that changed. They're trying to eliminate that. I understand that this is a hardship to do this, but it would have been a hardship even if we don't change this. If you wanted to make a 50% improvement to your piece of property, you have to do it. It requires you to do that. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that all we're simply suggesting is that we are trying to speed up the federal government's goal, which has been around ever since the NFIP came into existence, which is, again, to get these properties flood-proof.
Thank you, Mr. Demmett. Any other member of the audience like to address the commission?
Hi, my name is Phil Russo. I have 6 properties on Manchester Road. All, of course, have been through the flood, especially in 2008. I have been born and raised here in Brentwood, so I have seen the nice problems we've had with this flooding issues. I do have to reiterate on one thing, though, that everybody's been talking about. No one has come to us and helped us whatsoever. To say the least, my business that's on Manchester Road, we worked out of a trailer in our parking lot for the first week, trying to rebuild to try to still occupy our business, on our properties. No one ever came to us to ask us what they could help us with physically or financially. We were on our own to do everything ourselves, which, we're business owners. We have to do what we have to do. But my point being is where is any of these scopes or suggestions for us to come to us and say, hey, you're in the floodplain, and this is what your property needs to be done to be in compliant with these new rulings? Me, myself, personally, I never have. No one has ever approached us, ever. And as far as Manchester Road being flooded, I will have to admit, a lady was stranded in her vehicle on Manchester Road in front of my property. So there has been issues on Manchester Road other than business owners ourselves. Guys, ladies and gentlemen, I will say this. Years ago, when Willie Wright was living, okay, he would go down to the creek down by Breckenridge, and he'd take the backhoe and clean that bridge off. By the time I could get back to my property, the floodwaters was gone. So instead of all of us being property owners going through to being compliant to try to bring up elevation, which, by the way, I don't see how it would be feasible to take a brick building and, we had 6 foot through our lawnmower shop. 6 foot, guys. How in the heck would we take our property and raise it to be in that elevation? How could we do that? It's physically impossible, like these people are trying to explain. Why not we really address the issue with the creek instead of all these property owners that we're still trying to recoup from the loss from 2008. I have 2 rental properties down a little west of where we're at on Manchester Road. They were sitting vacant, had tenants in them the day that storm came on a Sunday, 7:30 in the morning. I just now, 2 months ago, leased that properties at a discounted rate of half the price of what we got back in 2008. Okay, here again, we had to remodel everything ourselves. We didn't get any state funds. We didn't get any municipality funds. We didn't get anything. We had to do this all on our own. We can't even take a loss when we come with a real estate assessment tax and they revalue our property and it's went up in real estate assessment. So that's the real issue. Instead of sitting there trying to redirect all the property owners to bring up elevation, how about we really try to address the issue with the creek? Where's this retention centers at? Where is all the natural, the natural retentions? To me, I think that would be more advantageous or feasible for everybody to take care of this problem, instead of it be resorted to the property owners to try to be in compliance. And when Mr. Weiss said there hasn't been any differences in this 45 years as far as improvements, well, heck no, we can't. How do we improve something? In this standards that we have, there's no way. There's just no feasible way. Yes, sir.
And to add a question, you said you had to spend all the money to redo after the flood.
Yes, sir.
You didn't have an insurance policy that covered your flood loss at
Sir,
that
I'd
time?
love to show that to you. It was about 50 cents on a dollar.
But you did get some assistance from flood insurance for your property. That's what I'm trying to
Sir,
establish.
that's why we pay the payments we do, so we can get some kind of reimbursement.
So I'm saying the city didn't help you, but the insurance company did.
That we had paid our premiums for, yes, sir.
Right, okay.
Yes,
So
sir.
that's what some of the FEMA issues are, trying to mitigate that loss, having repetitive losses over time That's what we're trying to establish. as
Totally
well.
understand it, and I totally agree with you. But my point being is, instead of these insurance claims, I think it'd be more advantageous for Brentwood and, Brentwood business owners and residential owners to address the real issue, which, let's face it, is the creek. I mean, don't you think?
I think there's a lot of that as well going on at the same time. This is not the only issue that we're having. It's what's in front of us, but there are other city administrators that are looking at other things as well.
Well, if you would take the corridor from Hanley Road to Brentwood Boulevard, and that's where most of my properties are, if you would do, for just 1 second, do a visual and try to visualize every commercial properties elevated, what in the world would we have there? What about the back line, the north side of Manchester Road? What about the back line where residents come in? Are they going to be sitting looking at a 20-foot, or not 20-foot, but 10-foot, concrete wall? Because then we really have to sit there and address that issue, because that becomes a whole new, that creates a whole new problem. So as far as I don't know where the grade is as far as in the elevation and what FEMA says we have to be, compliant with this 1 foot. I just truly know, guys, we had 6 feet of water through our business. We lost everything, literally everything. So what would that mean to me? That I have to be 7 feet? Because if I take my 6 feet in 2008, I add my 1 foot, so I need to take my building and raise it 7 feet? It's just not feasible. I mean, there's just no feasible way. So that's my only thing. There's just no way that us property owners can just keep on absorbing, these kind of losses. There's just no way. So that's what we're really having the issue with. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Russo.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Demmett.
Mr. Russo, thank you for, you can go ahead and have a seat. I don't have any questions for you. Thank you for raising some interesting points, and I think some others have raised them as well. And I can't speak to the issue completely, and that is that the city ought to take a look at the source of the problem. I couldn't agree more with you. And I know a lot of you people have mentioned that. And I don't want you to think that we haven't done that. That has been done. And I think Justin could actually maybe in a minute or so explain. I know a study came out just this past summer by CH2M Hill, an engineering report, to look precisely at that issue. What can be done about the flooding as far as the source is concerned? Because I don't want you to think all of a sudden let's put this all on the property owners, because that's not our approach. It was first, let's see if something can be done about the creek and the source. And I think the requirements were, I know the mayor has recently spoken about, there's a 5-acre piece of property that they're in negotiation with right now to try and lower that elevation by 20 feet. That would then result in, that's right at a bottleneck, right at a turn, and that would hold a lot of water, number one, and it would increase the flow so you're not backing up, which would possibly also have the effect of reducing flooding into Brentwood Industrial. Is that fair to say, Justin?
Correct.
But I think as a result of the study, the thought was there are some suggestions that can be done, but at the end of the day, the flooding cannot be eliminated. There's nothing that can be done about it because of constrictions on us. We can't do anything that affects the downstream flow, other municipalities, for instance. So if we try to do something and it affects another municipality down the flow, downstream of the creek, we have a problem on our hands. So there's only so much that we can do. And I believe the thought process, though, was its conjunction of the city doing something along with private property owners. Is that correct, Justin?
That is correct.
So I just wanted to bring that out because I thought that was an excellent point that Mr. Russo made, and just to bring to light that we have tried to do some things about the source.
And Mr. Russo, you make sure you give your dad our regards. That guy's a legend on this commission. Any member of the audience like to address the commission? Yes, sir. Step up, please.
Ladies and gentlemen of the board, my name is James O'Leary. I'm from 8418 Rosalie. I represent one of the residences, and apparently we are now in a floodplain, which I don't quite understand because we didn't receive any problem during 2008. And I see some of my neighbors also out here. I have a few questions, and I sincerely apologize for not being here a month ago. I was out of town on business. But we're talking about reduced insurance I can't come up with the word off the top of my head, but premium, thank you, insurance premiums. But usually the way you reduce your premium is by increasing the pool of people that are paying into that premium. And that's one of the questions that I have is, why am I going to be paying into this new premium? Because I wasn't previously on a floodplain. At the same time, I've also heard the words exception used for residential people in this area, because there are, I think the number was a dozen homes that would be affected. And my question is how exactly is this going to be addressed? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wise?
And if you'd like, I can address
Please.
a couple of those comments. If you don't have flood insurance right now, you will not be required to have flood insurance based off of anything in here. When we sent out the notices, simply because you received a notice does not mean that you're in the floodplain. It means you're close to the floodplain. That area along Rosalie, kind of where it goes around the bend through there, the floodplain line actually runs in the middle of the street, so it doesn't affect most of the properties through there. In order to be cautious, we wanted to make sure that everyone received notice. That's likely why you received the notice. So simply because you received the notice does not immediately imply that this would negatively impact you. So.
Thank you, Mr. Wise. Yes, sir.
I am Mike Brownless with Jasper Engines and Transmissions. We're at 643 Hanley Industrial Court. We've been on Litzinger since '64 and moved to Hanley Industrial, 92 I guess it was. We've seen flooding maybe one time, but only on the street, down further near, how shall we say, the bicycle shop or whatever it is. And we really haven't experienced anything, but I have a couple questions, and like Mr. Epstein said a while ago, the devil is in the details, and we as business people, we don't make decisions if we don't know the details. How can you guys make decisions if you don't know the specific details of what Uncle Sam's going to do? Okay? We own the property. It's outright paid for. So I take it from you, we don't need the flood insurance?
No, the only point I made was that if you have property that is backed by a federally insured mortgage, you have to have flood insurance if you are in the floodplain. If you own your property outright, you do not. You can have it if you want, but you don't have to have it.
Okay. What if we decide to sell the building and upgrade them? Do we have to make those improvements, or does the existing person do it who's purchasing it?
No, it would have to do with the new owner and whether that new owner was financing it or buying it outright or was even going to have flood insurance. And we're only talking about an entitlement to a premium reduction. And as you pointed out when you first got up and spoke, we don't know what the amount of that reduction might be. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about an elimination of a premium. We're simply talking about a definitional part of the ordinance which would benefit somebody seeking to buy insurance by allowing them to buy it at a somewhat reduced rate. And I don't know what the somewhat is and whether it's even worth it. But that's the concept we're dealing with. We're not talking about eliminating the need for insurance or requiring it one way or the other. All this ordinance does by the inclusion of that definitional information is provide you the possibility, depending on what points you accumulate, as was pointed out earlier, towards the CRP, that whether or not you can take advantage of that somewhat reduced premium. That's the sum total of what we're dealing with.
We're considered as light industrial right now, and like Mr. Epstein said a while ago, Hanley Industrial is going more and more towards business type thing. Is that on the projection to see that, and is that what you want to see as the board, in that you want it to go more business?
That's
light duty business?
Yeah, we don't
But the reason I ask that is
that is the question.
Our existing, the way I get our product in, is nothing but heavy duty tractor trailers. Are we going to be ordinanced out, or we can't do that? Is that another stumbling block for us? So anyway, as far as preventing the flood, yeah, you're asking the landowners, property owners, MSD down along River de Pere. I don't know who helped funded that, but there's a big levee there, and river large retention ponds can help control it as it comes up. So, and that's all I have.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name's Greg Otto. I'm a partner with Jenkins and Kling. And we also represent Lipton Brentwood LLC. They operate the storage bank facility on Manchester Road, just, I guess it's east of Brentwood. And I've been sitting here feeling like, boy, we're having a great academic discussion. But there's some real reality behind this. And, I'd love to hear from Mr. Dimmitt, from Mr. Wise, exactly how this works for all these businesses that are in that valley that is down Manchester Road, basically between Hanley and Brentwood. We've done some research into the storage bank facility. That's 5 feet, currently about 5 feet above Manchester Road. But it's also 6 feet below floodplain. Now, if we have to tear down that building, redo that building, how do we flood-proof it? Do we have to take 2 acres of property and lift it 7 feet, put in 7 feet of fill? If we put in 7 feet of fill, where does the water go when it hits that 7-foot wall between our neighbor's land, because we came up 7 feet and they stayed there, and the property behind us and to next to us? Where does that water go in terms of Manchester Road? Mr. Dimmitt has mentioned there's floodproofing, but I haven't heard anything about what that floodproofing is. How people can be sitting here thinking about voting in favor of something like this with having absolutely no idea of the practical implications is astonishing to me. Now, I've heard berms. Well, you know what? Berms divert water. Mr. Dimmitt, you mentioned that you can't take water and throw it on the next county. Well, there's about 300 years worth of law that says you can't take water and divert it onto your neighbor's property. So a berm would do that. So I'd love to hear from Mr. Weiss, Mr. Dimmitt, Ms. Bilderback. What do these landowners in that valley there, what are they supposed to do? If they're going to spend cumulatively over 3 years, 5 years of the life of the property, what do? What happens to your sales tax when all those businesses go away because it costs multi-millions of dollars, if it's even possible, to raise that entire area? I'm thinking back to those days 15 years ago when some genius decided to take all the hills out of Highway 40 by Mason, where they lifted things up. I don't know how many millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to do that, but what are we talking about here? And I'd love to ask the question and see if anybody has a good answer for it.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and state your piece, and then I'll give them an opportunity to respond after you're finished.
Well, my piece is, particularly in that, well, what I will call valley there, what does a property owner do? And I'll tell you, storage banks, has to be 10, 15 feet above the properties that are below that. Mm-hmm. How does one flood-proof those properties? Okay, and if you can't tell us that, how can you vote for this?
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Otto. If anybody would like to respond, they can. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next person.
Well, I don't know if I could. I'm not familiar enough with your property to give you exact answers by any means. But there are examples where parking is placed under the building to elevate the building up.
Okay.
So aside from that, I don't know if I can give you direct answers on what you or your the business that you represent, what they should do. I don't think I can answer that question tonight.
No, that's what I was going to suggest as well. And again, caveat: I don't do that for a living. I rely upon experts to tell me what they're. But in terms of water displacement, it would seem to me that if you talk about a building constructed on pylons, you have less water displacement as far as your neighbors are concerned, because you don't have a big building sitting in a lake of water. The building that's sitting up allows the water to go underneath, and there's not as much.
Mr. Chairman, could we please be respectful?
Yeah,
I'm
please.
sorry, but
Yeah,
whatever your opinion is, could you at least let him finish without laughing at him? How about that?
I don't interrupt you guys. When you come up here and talk, I appreciate the same courtesy. So the water goes underneath the building. You don't have the same water displacement. You see what I'm saying?
No,
I'm not sure
I do.
if I'm explaining that.
But where does that water go then?
Well,
It doesn't displace, but it still keeps going downhill. Where does it go then?
Well, I would assume it would do what any water does, and it sits there until the creek recedes and the water would go back with it.
Okay.
I don't. You asked for it. That's my thought.
Well, I guess my primary point is, I hear you're saying, I assume, I guess, I suggest, I think, maybe. I mean, maybe I go back to Mr. Holtzman's point. It seems like there has to be a heck of a lot more thought before people go through with this, and how anybody could be sitting here thinking about voting in favor of this without a lot more thought is quite scary.
Well, I guess my question, though, then, continuing with this discussion, is where was this concern before we looked at this ordinance? Because you still are faced with the same predicament. If you do, because that threshold is still there. That threshold which requires them to bring it flood compliant. So whether it's under the ordinance as it sits today, or if we made this amendment to add the word cumulative, the threshold would be met. And prior to that, I haven't heard one person ever complain about how in the world am I going to make my property compliant with the flood codes.
And I'll be perfectly blunt. I don't know how you fix that problem today. Let's pick any, with the existing ordinance, I don't know how you redevelop any property along that corridor without affecting the other properties or having it completely undevelopable, whether it's from a pure physical standpoint or for an economic standpoint. If anybody along that corridor with the hill going down there gets to the point that they have to tear down their building, I can't see how you're ever going to have any redevelopment if they can't build at grade. And if they bring it up grade, again, based on what our engineers say, we're only about halfway down the hill. We're 6 feet below floodplain, and we build up. What does that do to everybody else? So yes, I have a problem with what's being proposed. That doesn't mean I don't also have a problem with the way things stand right now. I think it's just a practical reality for everybody here as to when we eventually have somebody who has to redevelop, how in the heck is that ever going to happen? And I have a feeling the answer is going to be it's just not going to happen. And there's going to be undeveloped property, at least in that area. I'm not familiar enough with Hanley Industrial and some of the other areas, but I've been up and down this area numerous times. And, you lose a property there, there's going to be no redeveloping. And that's not a threat. That's not a exaggeration. It's just an economic reality. And, there's been a lot of talk tonight about, the flood insurance premiums may go up by $5,000 or $10,000. I think most of the people sitting behind me are saying, well, shoot, if I have to raise my property 5 feet, 6 feet, 7 feet, that's millions and millions of dollars, not, an extra $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000, a year after year after that. I tend to agree with some of what's been said up here about not liking as a taxpayer to subsidize, people's flood insurance. But I think the answer to that should be left to FEMA, not to the local, commissions and, boards of aldermen. I think if they allow rates to rise, then rates should rise, and let the market take care of itself. But I don't think there's been quite enough thought as to the practical reality of this to business owners, to what happens to the city when those business owners go out, and what might happen to adjacent owners when you have piecemeal redevelopment of bringing some of these things up to the floodplain. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Otto. Any other member of the audience like to address the commission?
Good evening. My name is Steve Hutkin with Hutkin Development Company, and I am a partner and property owner in several properties in the city of Brentwood. As an owner and investor, I think I just have one question. Assume for a second that we're correct, and you simply cannot flood-proof a property. And now we have reached the 50% or 51% limit, and we cannot comply with the ordinance. And now we cannot put tenants in the building. What's the penalty? Do you take the building from us? Do you tell us you can't put tenants in there anymore? You can't comply, so therefore you're over the limit, so now you can no longer put tenants in your building because it requires a permit to do it? Am I having forced vacancy? I'm just curious as extrapolate it all the way out, and now I simply can't comply. What's the penalty? What's the result? Do you have the power to enforce this? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wise, if you know the answer, I don't know if you can really predict what the courts would do in a situation like that, but do you know?
I mean, under the city's process, under the proposal that's before the commission this evening, if they were to hit the 50% and they didn't comply, we would not issue permits for anything until it complied.
So we would have no tenants. We could not lease the property any further. Is that correct? Because you would not issue.
Well,
all right. Please, if you have another question, step back up here, Mr. Hutkin. Mr. McCarthy's having a heart attack.
I apologize. So by saying you won't issue additional permits means you won't issue any sort of permit, whether it be construction, whether it be occupancy. So if I had a partial roof cave-in, at that time, I couldn't get a permit from the city to fix my roof. If we had a tenant who needed to come in to get an occupancy permit, I could not get an occupancy permit for that tenant. If I had a wall cave-in or a retaining wall that needed to be replaced and I needed a permit for that, I could not gain that permit. So therefore, I could no longer maintain my property, nor could I lease it. If I can't get
a couple
permits.
of comments. So one, an occupancy permit can be issued. There's nothing in here which would preclude an occupancy permit. It's not tied to occupancy, it's tied to the building permit.
But if I can't fix the space in order to meet the occupancy requirements.
Correct. But those are two separate
Because
permits.
I can't get a permit to do the improvements to get the occupant in the space, so therefore I wouldn't be able to get an occupancy permit.
Correct. Okay. But it would be technically what we would be using is the building permit, not the occupancy permit. Okay. But I think your point is still
So by
valid.
not getting the building permit, I will not be able to put tenants in the building.
Unless you comply with
So the city will then basically, for lack of a better term, sort of, I don't want to use that term. The city will be placed in a position that it will keep me from being able to lease my property. Because I have now done something that I think this particular city and every city that we have property in encourages, which is to reward property owners for improving their properties, not penalizing them for improving their properties. And what this ordinance does is it penalizes us for improving our properties. And it doesn't reward us for improving the properties. And the mere fact that we put on, and I'll give you a perfect example, the top of the line Sarnafill roof. It's the same roof that's on the Edward Jones Dome and on the hockey arena. It's the top of the line roof. We put that on Brentwood Industrial. All of the improvements that we do, we tend to do at a top of the line basis. What this ordinance does is it completely disincentivizes us from doing those types of improvements. And it keeps all property owners from doing the absolute minimum. And then if we hit that threshold, which we will if you impose a lifetime cumulative ordinance, we will hit that threshold. We will not be able to gain permits to do any further improvements, and the buildings will rot. And we will not be able to get tenants. That's what's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hutkin. Okay. Any member of the commission like to address any member of the audience like to address the commission? If not, let's open it up to.
I have one more thing.
Sure.
My name's Mark Mannion. I own 4 or 5 buildings in the Hanley Industrial Park. And what Steve was saying sounds like it's a realistic situation that could happen. I have properties both in the floodplain and outside of the floodplain. What is the investment of my properties now outside of the floodplain as a result of the situation with the properties in the floodplain? Is the integrity of the industrial park at risk? I'm concerned from that angle as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it back up to the commission members. Would any other commissioner like to make a comment? Or yes, Mr. Glowski.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this dialogue has been very helpful to me. I'm very glad that we opened it up to public discussion at the last meeting. And the conclusion I've come to is that this does need more study and more discussion, more analysis. And I would not be in favor of moving forward with this tonight until hopefully we can have some type of analysis done of the potential impact of this ordinance with or without the cumulative limit.
Okay, I think it's a good point. But the retort to that is by moving in a certain direction, if the commission was to move in a direction that would not include these 2 definitions, for instance, that does not foreclose this commission from addressing that issue down the road. Should we be presented with new evidence of a premium, the actual premium impact, new evidence of the flood insurance program being affected. So I would, just to make that point in response to Mr. Glowski, but your point is well taken, Mr. Glowski. Yes, Ms. Bilderbeck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, my thought process on this is not hinging just on the premiums that the property owners pay, and the city owns some flood properties, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. I think it's sound public policy. I think it's been a period of time coming. I understand that it's going to be painful for some folks. I still think for the betterment of the community that this is a good idea. I still strongly support and advocate for the lifetime. I've actually spent 18 years in my career looking at ordinances like this. I've spent the last 2 months looking at this in detail. I've considered all the comments of the audience in detail, of our citizens in detail. You know, just because we don't agree with each other doesn't mean that I haven't heard what you all have said and that I haven't considered it. I would also say that, you know, when we do things like this, you've got to look at the long term, and I do. Sometimes these things are challenging in the short term, but in the long term it's beneficial. And just as some would say that we don't know what the quantitative costs are exactly on the premiums, or we don't know what this is going to be exactly, well, neither does anyone in the audience. So I would take a little bit of personal disagreement with the fact that anyone would insinuate or actually outright suggest in this meeting that I haven't given this full consideration, that I haven't looked at all of the facts. And in my personal opinion, I think that this makes sense. I think it is good for the city. I think it's good for the community. I think there's a public policy interest. I think there's, you know, who knows, maybe even some future floodplain preservation interests that might tie into some of all the money that we've been spending on these flood studies. I don't really see any reason not to act on it tonight. And actually, I would like to make a motion that we approve this ordinance.
Can we just see if there's any other comments before you?
We can, but I'm making the motion.
Okay, what's the motion?
That we approve this as written with the one change to the term does not apply to number C or letter C, that it be revised to say any improvement that does not require a permit under the applicable codes enacted by the city of Brentwood.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
All right, we're going to keep the conversation going here. Is there any other discussion that anybody would like to make on this? Mr. Moore?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know,
I think that there needs to be some credit given to the participants tonight in being well prepared and making quantitative cases, some missing some figures, some others not. But ultimately what I see and what I hear is a top-down squelching of free enterprise. And without going into a large rant, it just seems to me that, I mean, this year I found out I can't finance college education anywhere but through the federal government, you know, and how many miles to a gallon we're supposed to get to our cars. And this just reminds me of another situation to where we're being told how to live. We have a problem in Brentwood. Yeah, the creek does not properly drain itself. I can't remember the MSD studies that were done, but it seems to me that the resources should be directed to that. And there was a comment earlier regarding a city employee who would go down in high water and clear the creek so that some of that property was spared. I mean, if that is in fact an option during the next flood, I would put that on the record that Public Works needs to keep an eye on that. Bottom line is that yeah, I'm not in favor of it in its current form, and frankly, I'm not even sure if it deserves any more study.
Okay, any further discussion? Motions to amend the existing motion?
Chairman Daming, I'd like to make a motion to amend Commissioner Bilderbeck's motion. The amendment would be that we would vote in favor of the revisions except for the definitions of substantial improvement and substantial damage.
Okay, so, and this is the proper way to do it according to Robert's rules rather than taking two separate motions. So the motion now is on the table is to amend Ms. Bilderback's motion to make the motion to approve the ordinance with the exception of the proposed definitions of substantial improvement and substantial damage. Yes, Mr. Wise.
Can I just have it clarified that the existing definitions would be in that motion? So that we would stay under the 50% under one period is what your motion is, right? So the definitions that are in your proposal that are crossed out would be what would move forward.
Correct.
Right. The motion is for the revisions. Yeah, the existing code remains intact.
Thank
Yeah. So it's Ms. Hansen's motion to amend. Is there a second to her motion? Okay, motion fails for lack of a second. Any further discussion on Ms. Bilderback's motion to approve the revisions as presented with the one typo that Mr. Wise had indicated earlier? If not, ready for a roll call.
Jeff Moore?
No.
Don Nuremberger is no. Sherry Bilderbeck?
Yes.
Yes. Dan Glossy?
No.
Jennifer Hansen?
No.
David Dimmitt?
Yes.
David Plefka?
No.
Clint Lewis?
Abstain.
Motion fails, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Motion fails.
I was just going to say, we might want to say what the next process is if that goes to the Board of Aldermen, because we're just out of a recommendation.
Good point. So the proposed revisions will now go to the Board of Aldermen with the understanding that should the Board of Aldermen wish to act on those revisions, it will require a supermajority of the Board of Aldermen to pass that in light of the negative recommendation of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Yes,
So
Mr. Wise?
is it, and I just want to, so the commission's vote is that you guys have rejected all of the changes in this draft.
That's correct.
And with the understanding that if that does not pass, we now have a non-compliant ordinance with FEMA, and that flood insurance could be jeopardized for all property owners within the city of Brentwood.
The commission acted, Mr. Wise.
I just want to make sure that I'm clear. Thank you.
Okay. Is there any report from any alderman? I see Mr. Toohey up here. You got a report, Mr. Toohey?
I do not.
Okay. City planners report, Mr. Wise?
No report.
Okay. We do not have a subcommittee. We'll be taking up the sign ordinance at the next regular session in May. Rationale, Mr. Wise, can you handle that?
Yes, sir.
Please, let us complete this meeting, please. Any other business to come before the commission? Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. We're adjourned.